For 1,000 years, our ancestors survived without electricity, insulation, or modern heating systems. They didn't just endure, they developed sophisticated survival methods that modern bushcrafters and preppers have largely forgotten. Today, we uncover 15 ingenious medieval techniques that kept entire communities alive through the harshest winters and brutal conditions. These aren't primitive skills. They're sophisticated solutions refined over centuries of trial and error. From central hearths that outperformed modern fireplaces to windbreak hacks that could save your life in the wilderness. From earth ovens that cooked perfect meals without fuel to animal fat applications that outperform modern synthetic materials. Earth ovens and clay cooking. Today, cooking means turning a knob or pressing a button. But for medieval villagers, especially in rural or nomadic areas, cooking meant creating the conditions for heat, insulation, and time. One of their most clever techniques still used in bushcraft and survival circles today is the earth oven. An earth oven is exactly what it sounds like, a hole in the ground that becomes a fully functional oven. The process began by digging a pit, lining it with stones, and building a fire inside. After several hours, the stones became intensely hot, hot enough to slow cook meat, roots, grains, or bread like flatbreads. Once the fire burned down to coals, the food was wrapped in layers of leaves, bark, or cloth, sometimes even clay, to protect it and trap moisture. Then it was placed into the pit, covered with earth, and left to cook for hours, sometimes overnight. This technique had multiple advantages. It required no metal tools, preserved fuel by trapping heat, and cooked food evenly and slowly, making tough meats tender and hard grains digestible. It was also safer. In times of conflict or secrecy, a buried fire gave off far less visible smoke and light. But earth ovens weren't just survival tools. They were part of the communal rhythm. In many villages, shared pits were used during feasts or large work gatherings, allowing people to prepare food for many using minimal fuel. These underground ovens became gathering points where meals weren't just cooked, but stories were told, plans made, and alliances strengthened. The related technique of clay wrapping, coating meat or fish in clay and placing it directly into coals, offered similar benefits. As the clay hardened, it sealed the juices in. When cracked open, the hardened shell peeled away the skin and scales, leaving behind tender, flavorful food with no modern tools required. Both methods reflect a larger truth. Medieval people understood how to use what was around them. Dirt, stones, leaves, and fire weren't obstacles. They were resources. And this kind of knowledge doesn't expire. Today, earth ovens are still used by survivalists, homesteaders, and indigenous communities around the world. No power required, just patience, preparation, and primal understanding. It's a reminder that you don't need stainless steel or electricity to make a good meal. Sometimes you just need a shovel and some fire. 3. Natural refrigeration. Before fridges and freezers, keeping food from spoiling was one of the biggest survival challenges. But medieval people had clever low-tech methods to extend shelf life using nothing but nature, techniques that are still useful in off-grid living and emergencies today. The first method was simple, underground storage. Food, especially root vegetables, dairy, and meat, was kept in root cellars or dugout pits lined with straw, leaves, or clay. Below the surface, the temperature remained cool and consistent, even during hot summers. Humidity was controlled with ventilation shafts, or gravelayers, reducing mold and bacteria growth. Many medieval homes had cellars dug beneath their floors, accessible by trapdoors. These spaces didn't just store food, they stored time. A cabbage that would wilt in a day above ground could last a month in the cool, dark stillness of the earth. For villages without permanent cellars, people used stone or clay jars buried up to the neck, often shaded by trees or walls. Butter was kept wrapped in soaked cloth. Eggs were submerged in lime water, and milk could be cooled in buckets lowered into wells or streams, the medieval version of a walk-in fridge. Even running water played a key role. Streams and rivers were used to keep wine, ale, and dairy chilled. Stone boxes or woven baskets were submerged in flowing water, where the constant movement prevented bacterial growth. Preservation wasn't only about cold, it was also about airflow. Grains, herbs, and nuts were hung in dry, elevated spaces, often near chimneys or rafters. The warm, dry air cured them naturally, preventing moisture buildup and insect infestation. This method worked for months, sometimes years, with nothing more than a rope and some patience. What made these tricks so effective was not technology, but a deep understanding of nature's patterns. Medieval people observed temperature, wind, humidity, and light not as data, but as instinct. They knew when to open the cellar, when to bury, when to wrap, and when to dry. In a modern blackout or off-grid lifestyle, these same principles still apply. Food doesn't need electricity, it needs the right environment. And that's something our ancestors mastered with dirt, water, and intuition. In a world increasingly reliant on artificial cooling, medieval natural refrigeration reminds us, sometimes survival is just a few degrees underground. Access to clean water wasn't guaranteed in the Middle Ages, far from it. Streams carried animal waste, wells could be contaminated, and stagnant ponds were breeding grounds for disease. Yet somehow, people managed to survive for centuries. One of their greatest survival tools? Simple, low-tech water filtration. The concept was basic but brilliant. Remove the visible impurities first, then reduce odor and sediment with a natural filtration process. One common method involved pouring water through layers of cloth, usually tightly woven linen. This removed large debris like insects, algae, and dirt. But that was just the start. For deeper filtering, medieval communities used sand and charcoal layers, often inside a ceramic vessel or a carved-out wooden trough. Water would be poured at the top and would slowly trickle through gravel, coarse sand, fine sand, and finally charcoal made from burned wood. Each layer had a function. Gravel caught stones and plant matter, sand filtered sediment. Charcoal absorbed odors, toxins, and microorganisms. The resulting water wasn't sterile by modern standards, but it was far safer than drinking directly from a river. And this system didn't require metal, pressure, or fuel, only patience and gravity. In wealthier homes or monasteries, stone basins were used to construct more permanent filtering systems where water flowed through channels carved into the rock. Rainwater collection was also key. Rooftops were angled to fill barrels or cisterns, sometimes lined with clay or pitch to keep them clean. Even the use of herbs and ashes played a role in water treatment. Certain plants like yarrow or thyme were steeped in water to reduce bacterial load, while wood ash alkaline could help reduce acidity or remove certain impurities. In survival terms, the brilliance here lies in the accessibility. None of this required advanced tools, just cloth, sand, wood, and time. Even today, similar sand filters are used in developing regions or disaster zones, endorsed by humanitarian organizations for their effectiveness. It's easy to take running water for granted until it's gone. And when it is, this ancient knowledge may be the difference between dehydration and safety. The next time you see a muddy stream, remember, medieval survival wasn't magic, it was method. 5. Using fat as light and heat. Before kerosene, candles, or electricity, firelight had to be made from scratch, and medieval people found a way to do it using something readily available: animal fat. In fact, tallow, rendered fat, was one of the most versatile survival tools of the era, used for both illumination and warmth. The process was straightforward. After slaughtering animals, usually pigs, sheep, or cattle, nothing went to waste. The fat was collected, slowly heated, and strained to remove impurities. The result was a thick, creamy substance called tallow, which could be poured into molds, stored in jars, or shaped by hand. For lighting, tallow was used to make candles and rushlights. A wick, often made from dried rushes, twisted linen, or even bits of bark, was dipped or embedded in the fat. The flame didn't burn as clean as beeswax, and it certainly didn't smell pleasant, but it burned long enough to read, work, or move through the dark. And more importantly, it could be made in almost any home, with no need for trade or coin. In survival situations, tallow had another benefit. It could be eaten. Though unpleasant, a small amount of rendered fat provided calories and energy. This made tallow a kind of emergency ration during long winters, sieges, or travel. Fat was also used to fuel small heat lamps, clay or metal containers with a wick dipped in grease. These devices warmed small spaces or cooked simple meals. Combined with a reflective surface, like polished metal or a white wall, they could brighten a surprisingly large area. But the genius of tallow didn't stop there. It was also used to waterproof boots and cloth, lubricate tools, soothe cracked skin, and preserve leather. One resource, dozens of uses. In modern prepping and off-grid communities, tallow is still respected as a long-lasting, multi-use item. It stores well, ignites easily, and provides a critical combination of light, heat, and fuel when other sources run out. Medieval peasants weren't just making do. They were innovating. They turned slaughter waste into survival fuel. And that kind of resourcefulness? It's as relevant now as it was 700 years ago. 6. Signal fires and smoke codes. Long before radios, phones, or walkie-talkies, medieval people had to rely on line of sight and flame to send messages across great distances. And in times of war, invasion, or emergency, they used a system as old as fire itself. Signal fires. The concept was simple, but the execution required precision, coordination, and timing. At key vantage points, hilltops, towers, or forest clearings, fires were pre-built and kept ready to ignite. When danger was spotted, like an enemy army approaching, the first fire was lit. That flame, visible for miles, would be seen by the next outpost, which would then light their own fire, and so on. Within hours, entire regions could be alerted to threats. Castles could prepare defenses, villagers could evacuate, and militias could mobilize, all without a single spoken word. But these weren't just random flames. Over time, systems evolved. The number of fires, the pattern of smoke, or the timing between them could signal specific threats. One fire might mean approaching danger. Two in quick succession might mean armed force. A delay could imply direction or distance. This practice was so effective that it remained in use for centuries, even appearing in military campaigns as late as the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's not just European. Indigenous peoples across the world, from Africa to Asia to the Americas, developed similar methods with coded smoke signals, making it a truly global survival tactic. But the technique wasn't just military. In isolated communities, smoke was used to signal for help, mark territory boundaries, or call seasonal gatherings. The key was visibility, timing, and interpretation. In survival terms today, this ancient trick is still incredibly relevant. Signal fires can be used in wilderness rescue, off-grid communities, or in grid-down scenarios. A well-built fire that produces black or white smoke can be seen by aircraft, hikers, or neighboring settlements and can save lives when communication fails. All it takes is a clear space, dry fuel, and something to burn green for thick smoke. And knowledge, of course. Knowledge medieval people mastered without ever picking up a phone. When you can't call for help, light can speak for you. And in the Middle Ages, they knew exactly what it was saying. 7. Herbal first aid. In the absence of hospitals, doctors, or pharmaceuticals, medieval people turned to what they had always relied on: plants. The medieval first aid kit wasn't made of plastic or metal. It was a garden, sometimes cultivated, often wild, and its ingredients were passed down not by prescription, but by memory and tradition. Wounds, infections, fevers, pain, all treated with herbs that many modern people walk past without noticing. One of the most common was yarrow. Applied directly to wounds, its leaves help stop bleeding and reduce inflammation. In a time when even small cuts could turn fatal, this plant was often carried in foraging pouches or tied into belts. For infections and illness, garlic was the medieval go-to. Crushed into a paste or steeped in wine, it acted as a powerful antimicrobial and immune booster. Thyme and sage, too, were used in tinctures and teas to treat respiratory problems and sore throats, especially useful during long winters in smoky homes. Burns and skin irritations? Comfrey was the answer. Known as bone knit, its roots were mashed into poultices to reduce swelling and promote healing. Plantain, a common weed, not the banana, was another favorite. Its leaves drew out poison from insect stings, blisters, and even snake bites. But perhaps the most widely used plant was nettle. Beyond its nutritional value, nettle tea was considered cleansing, reducing joint pain, clearing skin, and treating anemia. It was survival in leaf form, food, medicine, and tonic in one. What made these remedies genius wasn't just the plants, it was the system of knowledge. Medieval people tracked the moon, the seasons, the soil. They knew when to harvest, how to dry, and which parts to use. Leaves, stems, roots, flowers. Some techniques even included incantations or religious rituals, blending healing with faith. And while modern medicine has replaced much of this with lab-made compounds, many modern drugs still derive from these very plants. Aspirin, originally from willow bark. Morphine, from poppies. Penicillin, discovered by accident, but medieval herbalists had already used moldy bread poultices to treat wounds. In survival situations, the logic still holds. No pharmacy? Know your plants. A few leaves and the right knowledge could mean the difference between healing and infection. Medieval medicine wasn't superstition. It was observation, trial, and centuries of lived experience. And today, when systems fail, those same leaves might save you too. The truth about medieval survival. We often look at the Middle Ages with a sense of superiority. No technology, no electricity, no modern medicine. But after these 7 survival tricks, maybe it's time to ask, who's really more prepared to survive without the system? Medieval people didn't rely on supply chains, smart devices, or digital weather forecasts. They read the wind, they knew the soil. They understood the language of fire, water, plants, and stone. Every day was a test of resourcefulness, and every household was its own survival unit. They didn't have to go back to the land. They never left it. Today, we pride ourselves on innovation, but we've outsourced almost everything that keeps us alive. Food, heat, water, medicine, communication. If the lights go out for a week, most people wouldn't know where to begin. That's what makes these medieval techniques so powerful. They weren't optional. They were life. And many of them still work, unchanged, for those who choose to learn. So maybe it's not about romanticizing the past. It's about respecting the knowledge it carried. Knowledge that kept families warm, fed, healed, and connected without a single wire or screen. And the question now isn't whether these tricks are still relevant. The real question is, if you had to, could you survive like they did? Now that we have explored these 7 fundamental survival techniques, let's address the most immediate threat to human survival in much of the medieval world: the cold. When temperatures plummeted during the Little Ice Age, medieval people couldn't simply turn up the thermostat or plug in a space heater. Death by freezing was a constant winter threat, yet they developed heating solutions so efficient that modern engineers are only now rediscovering their principles. While today's power-dependent heating systems leave millions vulnerable to blackouts, these next 10 forgotten medieval heating techniques required no electricity, minimal fuel, and could be implemented with locally available materials. From heat-storing stone beds to ingenious chimney designs that extracted every calorie of warmth from precious fuel, these techniques didn't just provide comfort, they kept entire families alive through brutal winters. Let's examine these 10 forgotten medieval heating techniques that modern homesteaders are finally beginning to appreciate. What if I told you that medieval peasants had heating methods so effective they might put your modern furnace to shame? From central hearths to heated floors, these forgotten techniques kept entire families warm during brutal winters. But how did they do it without electricity or insulation? In this video, we'll uncover 10 ingenious medieval heating methods that not only worked, but also brought communities closer together. Get ready to travel back in time and discover how our ancestors turned survival into an art form. Central hearths, the heart of medieval warmth. At the center of every medieval home was the hearth, a simple yet brilliant solution to combat the intense cold. Unlike modern fireplaces, which are placed against a wall, medieval hearths were positioned in the middle of the main room. This allowed heat to spread more evenly, warming every corner of the space. The hearths were built with stones that absorbed heat from the flames and continued to radiate it for hours, even after the fire died down. It was like having a natural heater in the center of the house. However, there was one problem: smoke. Since medieval homes lacked efficient chimneys, smoke would slowly rise and escape through a hole in the roof, leaving the interior filled with soot and a strong burnt smell. But the peasants didn't mind too much. For them, the warmth provided by the hearth was what mattered. It was where families gathered to cook, eat, and share stories. The hearth wasn't just a source of heat. It was the heart of domestic life, a symbol of comfort and security during the harsh winter. And while the hearth kept the interior warm, the peasants also had techniques to harness external heat. But that's a story for the next topic. Solar heating, harnessing the power of the sun. While the central hearth warmed the inside of homes, medieval peasants also knew how to harness external heat, the sun. Medieval architecture, though rudimentary, was incredibly efficient at capturing and storing solar energy. Homes were designed to maximize sun exposure during winter, when the sun was lower on the horizon. Large south-facing windows allowed sunlight to enter and warm the interior. Thick stone or clay walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, maintaining a stable temperature. It was a primitive but effective form of passive solar heating, a technique we still use today in sustainable buildings. Additionally, peasants used materials like wood and straw, which had natural insulating properties. These materials helped retain heat inside the house, preventing it from escaping quickly. In colder regions, homes were partially buried in the ground, providing additional insulation against the freezing exterior. But solar heating wasn't just about comfort, it was a matter of survival. On sunny days, peasants opened doors and windows to let heat in, while on cloudy days, they relied more on the hearth and other heat sources. This combination of techniques shows how medieval people were masters of adaptation. They didn't have advanced technology, but they used what was around them in clever ways. And while the sun warmed their homes, animals also played a crucial role in heating. But that's a story for the next topic. Thatched roofs, nature's insulation. If you've ever seen a medieval house in movies or illustrations, you've probably noticed the thatched roofs. These roofs weren't just charming. They were a practical and effective solution for keeping heat inside during winter. Made of densely packed straw, they acted as natural insulation, preventing heat from escaping and cold from entering. Straw was an abundant and cheap material, making it ideal for peasant homes. Besides being a great thermal insulator, it was also water-resistant, helping to protect the house from rain and snow. However, thatched roofs had their challenges. They needed to be replaced regularly, as they rotted over time and could attract insects and rodents. But for the peasants, the benefits outweighed the inconveniences. During winter, the thick layer of straw helped retain the heat generated by the central hearth and the sun inside the house. Additionally, straw was a lightweight material, making it easier to build and maintain roofs. Interestingly, thatched roofs also had a social role. Building and maintaining roofs were community tasks that brought neighbors and families together. Heated floors, the warmth underfoot. Imagine walking on a warm floor on a freezing winter morning. For medieval peasants, this wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. They developed an ingenious technique to heat their floors: heated stones. This technique involved using large stones which were heated in the central hearth and then placed under the wooden or dirt floor. The stones retained heat for hours, radiating it into the room and keeping the inhabitants' feet warm. It was a primitive form of radiant heating, similar to the modern underfloor heating systems we use today. In addition to stones, some peasants also used bricks or clay to build floors that absorbed and retained heat. These materials were especially effective in partially buried homes where the ground helped insulate the heat and maintain a stable temperature. But heated floors weren't just about comfort. They also had a practical role. In homes where the floor was damp and cold, the heat from the stones helped dry the moisture and prevent illnesses. Additionally, the radiant heat from the floor complemented the central hearth, creating a more pleasant environment for the whole family. Of course, this technique required effort. The stones needed to be heated regularly, and the floor had to be carefully built to avoid fires. But for the peasants, the effort was worth it. After all, in a harsh winter, every source of heat was precious. Bed warmers, warming pans, and canopy beds. After a long day of work in the cold, nothing beats a warm bed, right? Medieval peasants thought the same, but without electric blankets or duvets, they had to get creative. The solution? Warming pans and canopy beds. Warming pans were metal containers, usually made of copper or brass, filled with burning charcoal. Before bed, peasants would slide these pans between the layers of bedding, warming the sheets and keeping the cold at bay. It was a simple but effective technique that guaranteed a few hours of thermal comfort. However, care was needed. Poorly placed pans could cause fires or burns. Canopy beds were another smart strategy. These beds had heavy curtains made of thick fabric that could be closed around the mattress. Besides creating a sense of privacy, the curtains helped trap body heat, turning the bed into a kind of warm cabin. To enhance the effect, some peasants used wool blankets or animal skins, which provided additional insulation against the cold. However, not everything was perfect. Hay beds, common at the time, were warm but also attracted rats and insects. Imagine trying to sleep while hearing the sound of rodents scurrying under the mattress. Still, for the peasants, warmth was more important than absolute comfort. And while warm beds ensured more peaceful nights, the medievals also had techniques to amplify heat during the day. But these solutions involved a bit of engineering and a lot of creativity. Heat reflectors, amplifying warmth. Imagine being able to increase the heat of a fire without needing more firewood. Medieval peasants did exactly that using heat reflectors, an ingenious technique that turned fire into an even more efficient heating source. These reflectors were made of materials like polished metal or smooth stone, positioned behind or around the hearth. The reflective surface redirected the heat from the flames into the room instead of letting it escape through the chimney or walls. It was a primitive but brilliant way to maximize the use of fire, especially in homes where firewood was scarce. Additionally, heat reflectors had a practical role. They helped protect wooden or straw walls from the direct heat of the flames, reducing the risk of fires. In larger homes, movable reflectors were used to direct heat to specific areas, like beds or work tables. But reflectors weren't just functional, they also had an aesthetic touch. Some were decorated with engravings or patterns, showing that even the most utilitarian objects could be an expression of art. Of course, this technique required some practical knowledge. Reflectors needed to be positioned correctly to avoid concentrating heat in a single spot, which could cause discomfort or even damage. But for the peasants, the effort was worth it. After all, in a harsh winter, every extra degree of heat made a difference. The resilience of medieval peasants during winter was a trial by fire for peasants. With freezing temperatures, limited resources, and harsh living conditions, every day was a battle for survival. Yet through creativity, teamwork, and resilience, they found ways to face the cold and ensure their families made it through to spring. From central hearths to communal bonfires, from thatched roofs to heated floors, every detail of peasant life reveals a deep connection to nature and an incredible ability to adapt. They didn't have modern technology or abundant resources, but they used what was around them in clever ways. And while they fought the cold, they also found time to celebrate life. Festivals like Yule and Christmas brought light and joy to the darkest months, reminding everyone that winter wasn't just a time of deprivation, but also of unity and hope. The story of medieval peasants teaches us that human resilience can overcome even the toughest challenges. They didn't just survive winter, they turned survival into an art form, using creativity, solidarity, and a deep understanding of the world around them. And you, how do you think you'd fare in a medieval winter? Could you face the cold with the same simple yet ingenious strategies? Let us know in the comments what surprised you most on this journey through time, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories about life in the past. We've now seen how medieval communities managed to survive harsh conditions through general techniques and sophisticated heating methods. But there was one group that faced even greater challenges: the shepherds, who spent months in remote pastures, far from the relative safety of villages and towns. These solitary guardians of medieval economies developed specialized survival skills that went beyond what ordinary villagers needed. With nothing but what they could carry and what nature provided, shepherds perfected the art of extreme self-reliance. Their techniques weren't just clever. They were essential knowledge passed down through generations of men and women who lived on the margins of civilization, where a single mistake could mean death. From predicting weather changes without instruments to creating emergency shelters in minutes, these shepherd hacks represent perhaps the most refined survival knowledge of the medieval world. As we explore these 7 medieval shepherd survival hacks, you'll discover techniques that could prove invaluable in modern wilderness emergencies or during extended grid-down scenarios. No shelter, no firewood, just you, a biting wind, and hours of darkness ahead. That was the nightly reality for countless medieval shepherds scattered across frozen hillsides. And yet, they survived. Not by luck, but through clever, low-tech strategies most of us have long forgotten. In this video, we're unpacking how medieval peasants endured brutal cold with nothing but what they wore, what they carried, and what the land could offer. No tents, no sleeping bags, just raw survival, built on wool, instinct, and pure grit. Body heat nesting. When shelter was out of reach and the winds turned hostile, shepherds turned to the most reliable heat source they had: living bodies. They slept among their sheep, sometimes pressed between 2 animals to trap warmth from both sides. Wrapped tightly in cloaks, they minimized skin exposure and let the flock's body heat shield them from hypothermia. The ground was still cold, but the animals acted like natural radiators. Records from Eastern Europe and alpine shepherds describe using lambs or dogs as core warmers. Small animals were wrapped and tucked against the chest or stomach, keeping vital organs warm throughout the night. Some even tied wool cords around themselves and the animals to keep everyone in place during sleep. It wasn't about comfort, it was triage against the cold. This practice wasn't unique to peasants. Medieval armies, especially during long campaigns, also adopted shared sleeping. Soldiers rotated positions during cold nights, curling around one another inside cloaks to conserve collective heat. In some winter camps, written orders required men to sleep in pairs, particularly among low-ranking infantry. Modern survivalists know this technique by many names: co-sheltering, shared sleeping, or double bagging in extreme conditions. It's still taught in military cold-weather survival schools and polar expedition training. The core principle remains unchanged. When heat is limited, isolate it, conserve and don't let it leak into the air. In a true survival situation, warmth isn't optional, it's strategy. Shepherds didn't just survive with this method, they normalized it. They knew when to rest beside a sheep, when to huddle with a fellow herder, and when to keep moving to avoid freezing stiff. For them, sleeping alone was a luxury and a risk they rarely took. 2. Cloaks as shelter. For medieval shepherds, a cloak wasn't just a garment. It was their shelter, their blanket, and sometimes their last line of defense. These cloaks were typically made of thick, untreated wool that retained warmth even when damp. Some were coated with animal grease, wax, or tallow, giving them water-resistant properties that modern fabrics try to replicate. In exposed conditions, the entire cloak could be wrapped over the head and body like a personal tent. Sources from 13th century inventories describe traveling cloaks passed down between generations of herders. They were heavy but durable and often equipped with a hood and a reinforced collar to shield the neck and ears. A shepherd could kneel beneath one, curl up tightly, and survive rain or frost without building anything. This method, while crude, mimicked the bivouac technique used by modern survivalists to trap body heat inside a low air volume space. More than once, a cloak was all a traveler had between them and a freezing death. In some regions, cloaks were lined with fur or layered with straw or dry leaves for extra insulation. If time allowed, herders would gather foliage, tuck it between folds of fabric, and sleep inside the improvised padding. It wasn't elegant, but it bought them the warmth needed to make it to sunrise. Today's wool ponchos and emergency bivy sacks followed the same principle. Wrap the heat, block the wind, and keep the body's warmth from escaping. Cloaks were slow to dry and smelled of smoke, sweat, and sheep, but they worked. In the absence of tents or tarps, medieval shepherds didn't complain. They just pulled their cloak tighter and waited out the night. 3. 6. Animal skins and grease. When the cold pushed past wool and windbreaks, shepherds reached for something more primal: raw fat and animal hide. Skins from sheep, goats, or deer were often used immediately after slaughter, while still pliable and rich in natural oils. Draped fur side in, these hides trapped heat, while their leathery backs blocked wind and moisture. But what made them powerful wasn't just the fur, it was what they did with it next. To boost performance, herders rendered fat from the same animals, tallow or lard, and rubbed it into both their cloaks and skin. This created a greasy seal that repelled moisture and slowed down evaporative heat loss. Some went further, mixing the fat with ash or powdered bark to create a tackier, long-lasting layer that stayed flexible even in sub-zero weather. These coatings were smelly and sticky, but they kept people alive. Regional methods refined the idea. In the Scottish Highlands, shepherds soaked woolen socks and leather wraps in hot sweet mixed with heather ash, then left them to cure in chimney smoke. Scandinavian herders used fish oil, applying it to reindeer pelts and letting it freeze into a crust that deflected snow and sleet. Even Eastern European steppe dwellers used bone marrow grease on the inside of leather boots, keeping feet warm on long rides. Modern bushcrafters echo these practices with beeswax and oil canvas treatments or vapor barrier liners in sleeping systems. The concept is identical: trap heat, repel wet, and block the wind from stealing warmth. Medieval shepherds didn't have Gore-Tex, but they had chemistry, instinct, and necessity. And their solution still outperformed synthetic gear when done right. 7. Night movement and micro-napping. Standing still in freezing air bleeds heat faster than almost any other factor. Medieval shepherds often combated this by breaking the night into active intervals and short power naps. Rather than lying down for hours, they'd walk or perform simple tasks, sorting fleeces, arranging stones, or stirring embers, until their core warmed enough to risk a brief rest. When muscles grew tired, they'd find a wind-sheltered spot, curl into a tight ball for just 10 to 15 minutes, then rise and move again. These micronaps provided enough recovery to stave off hypothermia without the long exposures that traditional sleep required. Written accounts from Pyrenean and Carpathian shepherds note that keeping limbs in motion prevented cold, stiff joints and maintained circulation. Modern cold weather survival training teaches the same active rest principle: short bursts of movement interspersed with controlled rest periods. Research shows that even minimal activity, wiggling toes, swinging arm, or walking a few paces, boosts metabolic heat by up to 20%. For shepherds on open slopes, this pattern turned a perilous all-night vigil into a manageable series of shifts. By refusing to lie still until absolutely necessary, medieval shepherds kept their blood flowing, their minds alert, and their bodies alive. In a true survival scenario, never underestimate the power of motion and the strategic nap. Surviving a freezing night without shelter demanded more than grit. It required knowing how to turn wool, earth, and biology into life-saving gear. Medieval shepherds mastered body heat nesting, cloak shelters, ground insulation, windbreak hacks, ember carriers, grease-treated pelts, and active rest cycles. Each tactic traded modern comforts for simple materials and raw ingenuity. Try one of these strategies on your next cold weather trip and see how history's poorest herders stayed alive. If you found these medieval survival secrets valuable, hit subscribe and ring the bell for weekly deep dives into practical history. Drop a comment with which technique you'll test first. Our community thrives on real-world feedback and adaptations.